I have spent 30 years reading dead men's paperwork. Most of it is dull. Deeds, ledgers, probate filings nobody asked to keep. But every so often a folder lands on the table that makes the whole room go quiet. The Kennedy file did that to me because the simple version you were taught is wrong. The family did not get rich and then pay the price the rest of us pay. In 1936, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. signs a set of trusts for his children, and from that day forward, the deepest part of the family's wealth has never sat in any single person's name long enough to be taxed the way yours will be. I am not a lawyer, and this is not legal advice. I am an archivist who keeps the receipts. What I can tell you is how the paperwork was built and why nobody at the time called it a scandal. Stay with me, because the part that changed how I see money does not arrive until the middle. Let me take you back to where this started. Joe Sr. was not born into the old families. He was the son of a Boston ward boss, sharp, impatient, and unwilling to wait his turn. The Brahmin families of Boston, the old Protestant money, kept men like him at arm's length. He never forgot it. That exclusion, I think, is half the reason he built what he built. If they would not let him into their world, he would build a fortress his children could never be turned out of. He made money the way ambitious men made it in the 20s, in the stock market, in real estate, and in liquor once prohibition ended. He had been a bank president before he was 26. He ran with the speculators on Wall Street, learned how the pools worked, how prices were pushed and dropped, and he understood that the market rewarded the man who got out before the crowd. He got out before 1929 took everyone else down. While other men were ruined in the crash, he held cash and bought what the desperate were forced to sell. There is a story, told often enough that he repeated it himself, that he sold his stocks when a shoeshine boy started giving him market tips. His reasoning was plain. When the man shining your shoes is in the market, there is no one left to buy. Whether the tale is exactly true or polished over the years, it tells you how the man thought. He watched the crowd and did the opposite. By the mid-30s, he was wealthy in the way that worries a careful man. He had 9 children. He had a fortune that, left alone, would pass through his own estate one day. And he was watching the federal government do something it had never done so aggressively before. The Revenue Act of 1935 had pushed the top estate tax rate higher than most people alive had ever seen, into the high 70s as a percentage on the largest estates. And within a few years, the top bracket would climb towards 77%. President Roosevelt had made it plain that he saw great inherited fortunes as a problem the tax code should solve. The wealthy were the named antagonist of the era. The era's top rates were not a rumor. They were the law, and they were climbing. A man with Joe Sr.'s holdings could do the arithmetic and see that a large share of what he built would be taken at his death, and then taken again at his children's deaths, and again after that. 3 generations, 3 cuts, each one slicing into a smaller pie. That was the antagonist, not a person. The estate tax and the simple, brutal logic of taxing the same dollar every time it changed hands. Most rich men of his generation accepted that as the cost of dying. Joe Sr. did not. In 1936, he sat down with lawyers and built something most families never even hear about. He did not leave instructions in a will for money to go to his children. He moved the money out of his own hands while he was still alive into trusts that would hold it for them and for the children after them. And here is the thing I need you to understand before we go further. Once he signed, that money was no longer his. He gave up the right to take it back. That sounds like a loss. To a man like Joe Sr., it was the whole point. Let me name exactly what he built, because the names matter. The first piece is what lawyers call a spendthrift trust. A spendthrift provision is a clause that says the beneficiary cannot sell, give away, or borrow against their interest in the trust before they actually receive it, and the beneficiary's creditors cannot reach it either. If one of his sons made a bad investment, married badly, or got sued, the corpus of the trust would not be exposed. The money was held for the child, but it was not the child's to lose. That is real trust law, and it still exists in nearly every state today. The principle goes back centuries to English common law. Courts wrestling with the question of whether a man could give his son the use of money while shielding it from the son's debts. By the time Joe Sr. sat with his lawyers, American courts had long since said yes. He was not inventing anything. He was using a tool that had been sitting on the shelf, available to anyone who knew to ask for it. You can see why this mattered to a man with 9 children and grand political plans. He was about to send sons into public life, into business, into the kind of exposure where a lawsuit or a scandal could drain a personal fortune overnight. The spendthrift clause meant the family wealth sat behind a wall that those storms could not reach. The second piece is the idea behind what we now call a generation skipping arrangement. The plan was never just to hand money to the 9 children and let it stop there. It was to hold wealth for the grandchildren and beyond, so that the corpus would not be fully taxed in each child's estate as it passed down. Think about what that means in practice. If money goes from grandfather to son, the tax man has 3 chances to take a bite. If the structure is built to skip a generation, holding the asset for the grandchildren rather than dropping it fully into the children's estates, you cut out one of those chances entirely. Multiply that across a century, and the difference is not small. It is the difference between a fortune and a memory. In 1936, the modern generation skipping transfer tax did not yet exist. That tax came decades later in 1976, written precisely because families like this one had found the gap and used it for decades. Congress saw what the structures were doing and built a new tax aimed straight at the skip. But the structure Joe Sr. used pointed at the principle long before the law caught up. He was 40 years ahead of the rule written to stop him. The third piece was real estate, held inside the trust rather than owned outright. And the crown of that piece arrived later, which I will walk you through in a moment. Now contrast this with what almost everyone does. The ordinary path is to keep your wealth in your own name your whole life, then leave it to your children in a will. It feels natural. It feels like control. But it means the wealth sits in your estate at your death, fully exposed, and then sits in your child's estate at theirs, exposed again. Joe Sr.'s choice was the opposite. Give it up early, on paper, so that legally it never sits in any one person's estate waiting to be counted. Let me walk the mechanisms step by step the way I read it in the file. Step 1. The grantor, Joe Sr., transfers assets into an irrevocable trust. Irrevocable means he cannot undo it. He cannot reach back in and pull the money out. This is the price of admission, and it is also the protection. Step 2. A trustee is named to control the trust, not the children. A trustee with a legal duty to manage the assets for the beneficiaries. The trustee decides when income is distributed and how the corpus is invested. The children receive the benefit, but they do not hold the keys. Step 3. The trust holds income producing assets, stocks, and crucially, real estate that throws off rent. The income flows out to the beneficiaries as distributions. The corpus, the underlying property itself, stays inside the trust. Step 4. Because the assets left Joe Sr.'s ownership in 1936, they are not in his estate when he dies in 1969. Read those dates again. 33 years passed between the signing and the death. The man set the structure in motion a full generation before it was tested, which is exactly why it held. You cannot build this on your deathbed. It has to be done early, calmly, while the lawyers have time and the assets have room to grow inside the wall. And because the trust is built to hold for multiple generations, the corpus is not fully recounted in each child's estate either. The income gets taxed as income, the same as anyone's. The body of the wealth, the corpus, keeps moving down the line, sheltered. The family pays tax on what it spends. It does not lose a great slice of the principal every time someone dies. That is the engine. Now the catch, because there is always a catch, and the families who win are the ones who accept it. The catch is that you genuinely lose control. Irrevocable means irrevocable. Joe Sr. could not change his mind in 1950 and take the money back for a new venture. The trustee, not the family member, holds the power. For most people, that feels like handing your house keys to a stranger. The old families understood it differently. They were not trying to control the money. They were trying to make sure the money outlived them without being eaten alive on the way down. You trade control for permanence. Hold that thought, because the question I could not answer for years was simple. Did it actually work, or is this just a clever theory? The file answered it, and the answer is the part I did not expect. In 1945, the Kennedy interests bought the Merchandise Mart in Chicago. If you have never seen it, picture this. When it was completed in 1930, it was the largest building in the world by floor area. More than 4 million square feet. So big it had its own zip code and its own train platform underneath it. It had been built by Marshall Field and Company as a wholesale showroom for the trade. Then the Depression came, and a building that size became a weight around the owner's neck. Half-empty floors still had to be heated, taxed, and maintained. By the war years, Marshall Field wanted out, and the mart came up for sale. Joe Sr. bought it. The number that survives in the record is roughly $13 million in 1945 money, which by various accounts was a fraction of what it had cost to build 15 years earlier. He bought a distressed giant at a distressed price, the same move he had made in 1929, only now the asset was 4 million square feet of Chicago floor space instead of a stock certificate. He did not buy it in his own name. He bought it into the family's trust structure. And this is the moment the whole design stops being theory and starts being a machine. A building like that is a river of rent. Thousands of tenants, showrooms, offices, all paying month after month, year after year. That rent became income that flowed out to the heirs through the trusts. Meanwhile, the building itself, the corpus, the thing that was actually appreciating in value as Chicago grew, stayed locked inside the trust. The family enjoyed the cash flow for decades. The asset that produced the cash flow was never sitting in anyone's personal estate waiting to be taxed at death. Think about the years that passed. Joe Sr. bought it in 1945. He died in 1969, and the building did not pass through his personal estate because it was never sitting there to begin with. It belonged to the family's trust structure, not to him as an individual. The mart stayed in the family's hands for decades, managed and improved, and was finally sold in the late 1990s for a reported figure in the region of $625 million. Read those two numbers next to each other. Roughly 13 million in, several hundred million out. More than half a century of rent collected in between, and the whole arc of that gain rose inside a structure built to keep the corpus from being chewed up generation by generation. I want you to sit with the patience of it. This was not a quick flip. It was an asset held across three generations of the family, through a world war, through the man's own death, through the deaths and tragedies that struck that family harder than most. Through all of it, the building stayed inside the wall, throwing off income to the heirs, growing in value the whole time, never once landing in a single person's estate. At the moment, a tax could have taken a third of it away. That is what a trust does when it is built right and given time. It is not a trick that saves money once. It is a vessel that carries an asset across the desks of the people who would otherwise have triggered a tax each time they passed. I want to be careful and precise here. Some of these figures have been reported different ways over the years, and trust records are private by design. What is not in dispute is the shape of it. The mart was acquired into the family's trust holdings, not owned outright by a single Kennedy. The income served the heirs. The corpus was protected. That is the design working exactly as designed in plain sight for 50 years. And nobody called it a scandal because nothing about it was hidden or illegal. It was paperwork signed in 1936, followed faithfully for three generations. Now let me bring this down to the ground, to people like the ones I grew up around. The ordinary way families pass on what they have built is to leave everything outright to the kids. The house, the savings, the small business, handed over directly, usually through a will. Parents do this out of love and out of trust in their children. And on its face, it seems like the honest, simple thing to do. But here is why it so often fails the family it was meant to protect. First, the tax. When wealth passes outright, and then your child later passes it to their child, it can be exposed in each estate along the way, depending on the size and the law of the day. The same dollar can be reached more than once as it moves down the generations. The very thing Joe Sr. spent his lawyer's time avoiding is the thing most families walk straight into. Second, creditors and lawsuits. Money left outright to your son becomes your son's money fully. If he is sued, divorced, or runs into debt, that inheritance is on the table. It can be taken to satisfy a judgment that has nothing to do with you or your wishes. A spendthrift provision is exactly what blocks that, and an outright gift has none of it. Third, simple human frailty. Wealth handed over in a lump to someone who has never managed it tends to evaporate. There is an old saying in my line of work: shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The first builds it, the second spends it, the third starts over. Outright inheritance is the fastest road to that ending because it puts the keys in the hands of whoever happens to inherit, ready or not. A trust with a trustee can release money slowly, at ages and stages, with conditions a careful parent would have wanted. An outright gift cannot say no to anyone, ever. And there is a fourth quiet failure, the one nobody likes to name. When everything is left outright and split among several children, the family itself often splits with it. Brothers and sisters who got along their whole lives end up in court over a house or a business that was handed to them as a tangled lump with no instructions. A well built trust holds the asset whole and names who decides what. It keeps the peace as much as it keeps the money. That is the quiet tragedy I have watched in folder after folder. Good families, real money, gone in 40 years, and sometimes the family gone with it, not because anyone was wicked, but because the structure was a will and nothing more. So, here is what the old families understood that the rest of us were never told. The structure outlives the person. A will moves money once, a trust holds it. Let me be clear about the next part. I am not your attorney, and what works for one family can be wrong for another. None of this is personalized advice, but I can tell you the names of the tools so you know what to ask about, because the words themselves are half the battle. The spendthrift trust. This is the protective clause we talked about, the one that keeps a beneficiary's interest out of reach of their own creditors and their own bad decisions until the money is actually distributed. If you care about protecting an heir from a future lawsuit or a hard divorce, this is the phrase to bring to a professional. The generation skipping trust, sometimes called a dynasty trust, where state law allows it. This is built to hold wealth for grandchildren and beyond, so the corpus is not fully taxed in each generation along the way. There is a real federal generation skipping transfer tax with its own exemption amount that changes over time, and it is precisely the area where you do not guess. You sit with someone who does this for a living, the irrevocable trust for heirs. This is the engine room, and it carries the hardest trade. To get the protection and to move assets out of your taxable estate, you generally must give up the right to take them back. Irrevocable means you mean it. That is not a flaw in the design. As we saw, it is the design. If you want to explore any of this, the person to find is an estate planning attorney, specifically one who handles trusts and is licensed in your own state, because trust law varies from state to state. Expect a real cost. A properly drafted irrevocable or dynasty trust is not a form you download. Depending on complexity, it can run from a few $1,000s into the low 5 figures to set up. That fee is the reason most families never do it. And it is also the reason the families who do tend to stay wealthy. Ask the questions, bring the words. Spendthrift, generation skipping, irrevocable. Let the professional tell you what fits. I am back at my own desk now, the lamp on, the Kennedy folder closed and set aside. What stays with me is not the size of the numbers. It is how ordinary the paperwork looks. A signature in 1936, a purchase in 1945, a sale half a century later. No magic, no crime, no hidden room. Just a man who understood that the difference between a fortune that lasts and one that disappears is not how much you make. It is the shape of the container you put it in. The rest of us were taught to fill a glass and hope it does not spill. They were building canisters. If this opened a door for you, do me a favor. Subscribe and stay close because I keep these folders coming, and the next one travels further than Boston or Chicago. The next file I want to open crosses an ocean. The Rothschild family is said to have moved wealth across borders through trusts and structures spanning more than one country for the part of 2 centuries. How a family holds money in one nation while living in another, and how the paperwork follows the bloodline instead of the border, is a different kind of machine entirely. That is the next folder. Until then, take care of yours.